Hello, and welcome to our next section in genetics, and we're going to talk a little bit about just some important ideas and vocabulary as we start looking more closely at Mendelian genetics. We need a little bit of background so that we can actually study this. And here are just a few little cartoons you can read, kind of making jokes about Mendel, but we're going to learn some very fundamental vocabulary terms and ideas and concepts that you're going to continue to use through this section. So, if you'll remember the 7 traits that Mendel studied in pea plants, we have those here. Remember, these are the traits: the flower color, the flower position, the seed color, seed shape, pod color, stem length. Those are the different traits. And you'll remember from the last section what a gene is. It's the section of DNA that codes for a particular trait. So the section of DNA that codes for the flower color, that would be a gene for flower color, or the gene for flower color. And you'll remember alleles specifically are different versions of a gene. So flower color, the trait flower color, has 2 different alleles, purple or white. Those are the 2 alleles. The flower position trait has 2 different alleles, axial or terminal. Seed color, there are 2 alleles for that, either yellow or green. So those are the different alleles, the different versions of a gene. Now let's look, what's this word, phenotype? It sounds scary, but it's really not. Remember, phenotype is the appearance. It's what it looks like, what you can tell on the outside. For example, the phenotype of this flower is purple. The phenotype of this seed is green. It's a green seed. That's its phenotype. It's what we're seeing on the outside. It doesn't have, we're not looking into its genetics and what the genetics are about it. We're looking at its appearance. Okay, so here's a little bit more vocabulary, and we're going to look at this in terms of crossing pea plants with different pod colors. Here we have a green pod, and we're going to cross that or mate it with the yellow pod. Okay, so here's our green and crossing with yellow. These are the parents. A lot of times we call this the pea generation for parental generation. Now, these are true breeding here. When they cross, when they mate, we have one allele coming from this parent and one allele coming from this parent. And look, our offspring in this F1 generation are all yellow. They all turn out to be yellow. We know then that yellow is what we call dominant. It's the one that shows. The green is recessive. It hides. We know that both of these parents passed on, this one passed on a green allele and this one passed on a yellow allele, but they all look yellow. Their phenotypes are all yellow. So we know that even though the green allele is present in the genetic makeup, it must be recessive because it's hiding, and the yellow is dominant. Here's another word, genotype. We talked about phenotype is what the appearance of the organism is. A genotype is the type of gene. It's what its genes look like. It's the alleles that are present. We know that the alleles present here, we're told, they're the parental generation and they're true breeding, so they have all one kind of allele. This one's all green, this one's all yellow. So there are 2 green alleles and 2 yellow alleles here. We know that this, in the F1 generation, would have 1 allele green and 1 allele yellow. Same here, it would have 1 of each. Now that brings us to these 2 terms. They look like great big scary words, but they're not. Homozygous is a genotype with two identical alleles. So what's homozygous here? Well, these, the parental plants, those are homozygous. And heterozygous are genotypes with two different alleles. We know that those are going to be heterozygous because they have one dominant allele and one recessive allele. Whereas the two parents, this one has all of the green allele and this has all of one kind. So here's something that is important to point out. Dominant does not mean normal or common or good, right, healthy. It doesn't mean any of those things. It simply means that it is the allele that shows. The recessive doesn't show. So when we start looking at dark hair is dominant to light hair. It's the one that shows. It is expressed in the phenotype of the organism. Curly hair can be both homozygous dominant or heterozygous. That can show the expression of curly hair. Straight hair is recessive. Here, I mean, these are just some different traits we've talked about. The curling tongue, if you cannot curl your tongue, that's recessive. But dominant, it doesn't mean that those who can curl their tongue are good or right or somehow better. It just means that that is the one that shows and is expressed. It's just the way we term things in genetics. So let's revisit this idea, the two laws that Mendel concluded and came up with. The principle of segregation was the first one, and you'll remember that means that only one allele is passed on by each parent. That's the definition of segregation in genetics. So, for example, we have our homozygous dominant plant right here, tall, and then the short is homozygous recessive. And each one passes an allele onto each offspring. So this offspring has one dominant allele from this parent and one recessive allele from that parent. So it would look like this. We oftentimes put the dominant allele as a capital letter and the recessive allele would be a lowercase of that letter. Every single one of the offspring now will have one allele from each parent, and in this case, that would make each of those plants heterozygous. Their genotypes are heterozygous. Let's review our principle of independent assortment. If you'll remember, it simply means that two traits are not related to each other. They sort and mix and are passed on independently from one another. Okay, so for example, if we have true breeding plants here, so they're going to be homozygous. We have a true breeding green pod with yellow seeds, and then we have a yellow pod with green seeds, and they're homozygous for both traits. We're going to get all green pods with yellow seeds. But what if we take heterozygous parents, all right, and we cross them? This is what we'd end up getting for our offspring. We'd get all these different combinations. And if you'll notice right here, we have not everything is green pods with yellow seeds, is it? Because they're sorting independently. It's independent assortment. Look at this. Here we have green and green. Neither parent is green and green. So that's, those are definitely assorting independently. Same here. We have yellow and yellow. Neither parent looks like that. So this just shows us that two traits can be genetically passed on and they are not necessarily related to each other. That is the principle of independent assortment. So here are a few advanced ideas for you. If you have other advanced ideas that you'd like to investigate and work on, that would be wonderful. And I look forward to seeing you in class and seeing what you can come up with.